Often referred to as the Edinburgh malt, Glenkinchie is the lowland malt in Diageo's Classic 6. The distillery is in farm country in rural Lammermuir Hills near the village of Pencaitland, only about 15 miles from the Scottish capital.
1837 is when we know there is evidence of a license being taken out. The name comes from the Norman conquest, when the De Quincey family were granted lands in this area, and De Quincey derived into Kinchie and then Glenkinchie, because we're in a little glen here. And in fact, the little stream that runs through and under the distillery is called the Kinchie Burn, hence the name. Glenkinchie, because of location, is a lowland malt, one of very few left in operation nowadays. Why is it different? It's different because of the location, because of the process, because of the size of the stills, because of the way we condense that spirit from the vapor into liquid.
One of the highlights in a Glenkinchie visit is the museum-like model distillery.
We have something on display here, which is a model of a distillery, the model was built in 1824. No other distillery has this model or anything like it. So without actually going around a distillery, a visitor can actually walk through this model and see every single facet of the process as it was then. The interesting thing for them then to do is, of course, to go on the distillery tour and compare then and now and see what differences there are. And in some instances, there are not very many. So what we have here is the raw barley intake. We went up through the elevator into a dresser, which took out straw, barley, stones, whatever. And the clean grain then went up into the loft area here to be stored on the barley floor, which is the equivalent of the floor right above us in the room we're in. From there, the barley was taken into the steeps. Water was added to start the germination process. That process, after a day to 2 days, took place on the germination floor here, where the grain was allowed to continue to germinate over 10 to 12 days. At the end of germination, it would have gone into the kiln, spread out on this mesh floor here, and heat from the furnace down below would have been allowed to pass through the grain for the drying process, excess heat and steam going out through the kiln roof, and the dried grain at the end of the process going forward into the bins. At this point in the process, peat could be burned and would have been used for the island malts and the west coast malts, less so for Speyside and obviously lowland malts, but that's the point where we can influence the peatedness of the barley. From the storage bins, where it would have stayed for 4 to 6 weeks perhaps, it was then taken through another dressing machine, and that took off little shoots and rootlets that were left in the barley. It was then weighed and went down through the malt mill to be ground prior to the mashing process. The grist from the mill went through into the storage bins above the mash tun itself, and from there we have the mashing process where the grist and hot water are mixed together through the mashing machine into the mash tun. Cast iron in those days, mostly you'll see stainless steel ones nowadays. Washbacks, traditionally we keep wooden washbacks at Glenkinchie. Some distilleries have moved to stainless steel. They both are pretty effective for what they do. Personally, I prefer to see the product fermented in wood. I think it just adds that little something to it, although I can't justify exactly what it adds to it. At the end of 60 hours fermentation, the product is then pretty strong alcohol, goes through into the still house to go through the double distillation, which will produce the final spirit. How is that vapor cooled? Well, it's cooled in worm tubs, and worm tubs vary a little bit from distillery to distillery. The traditional ones have wooden circular tubs like these, and you can see the coil going into it reduces in diameter from top to bottom, where you've got lots of vapor in the top and you're in the liquid phase at the bottom. Cold water coming up through there to aid the cooling, and the distillate then returning back into the distillery to the spirit safe, where the stillman can actually see what's going on in the process for the first time. He can see the alcohol, he can measure the strength of it, he can see the clarity of it. Having got the spirit in the spirit receiver in the still house, it then is transferred to the filling store, where we measure how much alcohol we've produced, and then obviously have to get that into cask. This is the point where, from a distillery, we've done all we can to influence the character of the spirit. We then allow nature to take over, because the short time that we've had to influence it is a matter of days. The spirit is then going to go into the cask to mature over something like 10, 12, 14, 16 years, depending on which distillery you're referring to. And for Glenkinchie, that's a minimum of 10 years in cask.